The first step in the 10 steps is to look at the title and see what sort of information you can glean from it, even before reading the poem. First frost. That makes me think of maybe the first snow of the year. Or when I just think of first by itself, I think of a new experience. So the speaker could be innocent or inexperienced in some way. Of course, when I think of frost, I think cold. Cold isn't a great thing, but what's interesting is that there's some alliteration here. And that makes it sound a bit more upbeat, even though it's cold. The next step is to paraphrase each section for meaning. Sometimes you can go by stanza, or other times you can go by sentence. Let's take a look at the first stanza. Well, clearly, this is a description of a girl in a telephone booth, and she seems to be cold and maybe crying. On to the next stanza. It seems like she's trying to warm her hands, so they're very, very cold. The next stanza, it looks like she's walking back down the streets. The penultimate stanza, I'm not really sure. It mentions the title, but it also seems to be about the conversation she just had. The final stanza clearly shows that this is the beginning of winter, but also we have this idea of the winter of being hurt, that perhaps cold is related to being hurt. The next step is to find what's weird and write down those questions so you know what to look for. Well, if I go stanza by stanza, the first thing I think is weird is that her coat is flimsy. Is it that winter was unexpected, or she's just poorly prepared? The next aspect that draws a question to me, that makes me think of a question, is the idea that she has to beat her way back alone down the streets. And I wonder, why alone? As we continue, I see two references, or the reference to the telephone conversation, the first frost of telephone phrases. And it makes me think, what was the conversation about? Finally, when I look at the last stanza, I see this verb glittering, but also it's paired with the word hurt. So my question is, why is this joyful or pretty perhaps? And how does it connect to hurt? The next step is really going through style, and this is where the deep meat of your annotations occur. You're looking for all those wonderful things you would normally find in poetry, figurative language, use of diction, etc., etc. So I'm going to kind of go through and annotate what I see. Well, a girl is freezing in a telephone booth. What's striking about that is the present continuous tense. And that means that it's currently happening and continues to happen. Also, I see these strong words here, huddled and flimsy. Now, both of these imply that she's trying to protect herself, but she's unable to. There's also this great description of her face, and with those strong words, both stained and smeared. In this case, it's by the tears and smeared with lipstick. In the next stanza, we get another description of what she's doing. She breathes on her thin little fingers. Gosh, thin and little make me think of what I saw before, huddled and flimsy. And not only does this indicate that her fingers are fragile, but there's a repetition here of it. Later in the stanza, we see the simile, fingers like ice. Now, when I think of ice, I think cold, of course, but I also think fragile. There's this metaphor, glass beads in her hair. And I think it's a metaphor because I don't think she actually has glass beads in her hair. I think it means ice. But it's interesting that the speaker of the poem chooses to describe the ice as glass beads. Again, glass is fragile. I look into the next stanza and I see this very strong word here, this word beat. And what it literally means is that she has to walk. But the idea of beating her way back alone down the icy street It makes me think of passion or aggression. Here we see the title mentioned for the first time, and that's significant even if I'm not entirely sure. What I also notice is it's in a short sentence all by itself. And then it's made clear, a beginning of losses, that it could be the first frost that it's actually cold, but here by saying a beginning of losses and putting it on the same line, it makes me think that first frost is metaphorical. That's continued with the first frost of telephone phrases. And if I look here, one of my questions was, what was the conversation about? Whatever it was, it caused her face to be stained by tears and her lipstick smeared. So this has to be the hurt. Looking at the final stanza, again, the word that sticks out to me is this idea of glittering. It's a visual image, but it also implies celebration or joy. That's then contrasted with the first frost of having been hurt. Here we have that again, that first frost. I wonder why he chose this metaphor to describe the first pain, since that's made very clear here. I think maybe it's because, winter is a natural thing. It's a cycle that comes, and indeed, while being cold in winter perhaps isn't wonderful, it will end. And you will have spring and then summer and then fall and then most likely again another winter. Once you've done this, now you want to go through and try to identify any patterns that you see. If you'll notice, I was using circles and underlining to indicate those patterns. So first, I see a lot of ideas of her defensive or fragile in some way. And I'm going to highlight all those patterns, all those instances where she seems fragile in blue. The next are really the descriptions of her sadness. And you'll notice I examined both the descriptions of her in pain, the literal descriptions, but also the references to pain, the references to loss or being hurt. Those tend to be the key patterns that we're seeing. Now, the next step, step 6, is to look at the structure in general. Well, first of all, we see that it's made up of 5 stanzas. The stanzas, most of them are 2 lines, but the very first one is much longer. And I asked myself, why is that? Well, it's mostly because this is a literal description. But that's not enough when we're looking at structure. What else I notice is that all of these stanzas are end-stopped. And that means that they have a punctuation mark, a full stop in this case, at the end of each one. In fact, as I look further, almost every single line is end-stopped. The only ones that aren't are here and here. And I can definitely see a connection between the idea of tears and alone, where these lines are enjambed. The other thing I notice about the structure is that there are also caesuras, which means punctuation in the middle of lines. Not many, but some. All of this combined, these constant end stopping and the caesuras within lines, make the pacing, the reading of this very, very slow. And that's aided by the descriptive details of it. Perhaps that's intended to make us stop and think. The other thing I notice is that it goes from the very descriptive and the literal down to the figurative, where here we see this blending of the first frost and her pain. The next step is to identify the speaker and the tone. I'm looking at what I already have here. The speaker seems to be an observer, and that simply comes from here, where we see the physical descriptions of her. I also say that he or she is an observer because we don't see any revelation of thought from the girl. We don't even know the specifics here. In fact, the speaker seems to be guessing as to the cause. And we know it's a speaker in the moment because of this use of present tense. Because of this information down here, where the speaker is describing first loss, the beginning of losses, the first frost of having been hurt, I get the understanding that the speaker understands what it's like to be hurt. and perhaps is even sympathetic, if he or she is able to understand. Now we go back to the title and go back to examine if we've been able to answer any of those questions of what's weird. Well, we look at the title again, and indeed, it could be referring to the actual snow, the cold. However, I think by looking at the descriptions down here, it's clear that this really means the first time she's been hurt. And I'm going to use some deduction where it's smeared with lipstick. She, I believe, was made up to look nice for someone. So I think this is not just being hurt, such as being teased on the playground, but the first time she's been rejected by someone she cares about, perhaps a boyfriend. As far as going through the questions I had, why is this flimsy? I think it's probably figurative that she seems vulnerable or fragile. Why it ends with this word alone, why must she go alone? Well, I think that's the key. Perhaps she was expecting someone to pick her up. And the final question, what was the conversation about? Clearly this is the breakup. So now I go back and ask myself, what message is being conveyed? And that's the theme. And I think the theme here is pretty straightforward. The feeling of loss is painful, but inevitable. And certainly in this particular instance, it's related to breakups. And that final question is an easy one. How is it done? Well, I've already identified. Not only that, but I've color-coded my patterns so that if I was meant to explain how this theme is communicated, I have groups of evidence that I can draw upon.